The sun was trying to kill everything that afternoon. It pressed down on the Llano Estacado like a flat iron on wet cloth, sucking the color out of the sage and bleaching the caliche road to the pale gray of old bone. Elias Cord had been walking since before dawn, his boots raising small explosions of dust with each step. His canvas jacket folded over one arm because wearing it was like carrying fire against your skin. He had 31 cents in his left front pocket. A folded letter from a man named Hargrove in his right. And in the breast pocket closest to his chest, a photograph so worn its edges had gone soft as chamois leather. He stopped at the top of a low rise and looked down. The farmstead sat in a shallow basin where a dry creek bed curled like a sleeping animal. It was not a prosperous-looking place. The fence line sagged in 3 separate places, the posts tilting like exhausted men leaning against one another. The barn roof had lost shingles on the east side, and the house itself, a 2-room affair with a narrow porch, wore its whitewash the way old men wear dignity, in patches, stubbornly. A kitchen garden fought the heat beside the south wall, and even from this distance Elias could see it was losing. A woman came out of the house. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had not rested properly in months. She carried a wooden bucket in each hand, and she walked to the stock pen where 2 mules and a milk cow stood with their heads dropped in the shade. She poured water into the trough without looking up. Then she stood there a moment, and Elias could see, even from the rise, that she pressed one hand flat against the small of her back and held it there. He came down the hill. She heard his boots on the caliche when he was still 40 yards out. She turned, and her hand moved toward the porch rail where a rifle leaned. She did not grab it. But she did not move her eyes from him either. He stopped at the gate and held up one open hand. "Name's Elias Cord," he said. "I heard in Abilene you might need a hand." She studied him the way you study weather coming from the west, looking for what it intends to do. "I need more than a hand," she said quietly. Then she seemed to catch herself, as though she hadn't meant to say it aloud at all. "Who told you that in Abilene?" "Man named Hargrove at the feed store. Said the Aldean place had gone to 1 woman and 2 children and 300 acres of nothing going right." She looked at him for a long moment. The heat moved between them like something with weight. "I don't need a cowboy," she said at last. Her voice dropped, not unkindly, but with a gravity that seemed to come from somewhere very deep and very tired. "I need a husband." If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. Her name was Clara Aldean, and she was 34 years old, though the last 2 years had put something in her eyes that belonged to a much older woman. Her husband, Thomas Aldean, had died of a burst appendix in February, not heroically, not in battle or in some dramatic reckoning with the land, but quietly, on a Tuesday, while the children slept in the next room. The farm had passed to her outright because Thomas had been a careful man with paperwork, whatever else he had not been careful about. And she had kept it, because she was not a woman who let go of things simply because they became difficult. She told Elias none of this in the first hour. What she told him was that the bunkroom off the back of the barn had a cot, a window with no glass, and a hook for hanging clothes. That she could offer 50 cents a week and meals. That she expected honest work and no drinking on the property. She said it all standing in the middle of the yard with her arms crossed and her chin slightly elevated, as though bracing against a wind that wasn't blowing. Elias said that sounded agreeable. The children appeared in the doorway of the house as if they had materialized from the shadows. The girl was perhaps 10, sharp-eyed and solemn, with dark braids that needed redoing. The boy was smaller, 7 or 8, and he had been crying recently, though he was working hard not to show it. His nose was still red at the tip. "These are my children," Clara said. "May and Samuel. They are not part of your work. They are not to be ordered about or disciplined by anyone other than me. Are we clear?" "We are," Elias said. May regarded him with the flat, measuring look of a much older person. Samuel stared at his boots. Elias put his jacket back on despite the heat, because it felt wrong to appear ragged in front of a house. The inside of the house was the kind of clean that comes from effort rather than ease. Clara was clearly fighting disorder on too many fronts with too few hours. The floor had been swept but not lately. The curtains were mended but hung crooked. A stack of harness leather sat on the table beside a tin cup of cold coffee and a child's primer open to a page about rivers. The kitchen showed evidence of a woman cooking for survival rather than pleasure: cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans in a clay crock, a half loaf of bread with the heel saved separately. Which told him she was rationing without letting the children see it. He noticed all of this. He said nothing. Clara had told him supper would be at 6. It was not yet 4. He took himself to the barn and assessed what needed doing, beginning not with the dramatic or the difficult but with the small, immediate things. The hinge on the barn door was stripped, and he reset it with a spare bolt he found in a coffee tin nailed to a post. The water trough had a slow leak at the seam. He packed it with tallow from a lump hanging in cloth. He checked the shoes on both mules. One needed resetting. He made a mental note. At 5:45, he washed his hands and face at the pump and sat on the porch step without being invited inside. Clara appeared at the screen door. "You can come in," she said, as though it caused her some small effort to say it. The table was set for 4. That struck him, and he had to look away from it for a moment. The 4 plates, the 4 tin cups. The quiet domestic faith that arranging a table for 4 required when you weren't sure the 4th person deserved a place at it. He sat where she indicated. The meal was simple: beans cooked with salt pork and a dried red pepper, a pan of cornbread that she'd managed to brown properly on the bottom, and a jar of preserved peaches she'd opened without ceremony and set in the center of the table like a small gesture of abundance in an otherwise careful meal. There was water and there was fresh buttermilk and there was the heel of yesterday's bread, which she put on his plate without explanation. He understood, then, that she had been saving it. Not for herself. They ate mostly in silence. Samuel ate with the focused intensity of a small animal. May ate with deliberate, watchful slowness, her eyes moving between her mother and this stranger like she was calculating something. Clara ate last, serving herself only after she'd confirmed the children had enough. Elias ate slowly and said, "These beans are good." Clara said, "They're just beans." "Yes'm. Good ones though." May said, without looking up, "Mama soaks them overnight in well water. She says it makes them sweeter." Clara said, "May." "It does though," May said. Elias looked at the girl. "Your mama's right about that. I've had beans that weren't soaked and they taste like saddle leather." Samuel made a sound that was almost a laugh. He pressed his mouth shut immediately and looked at his plate. But it was there a flicker. The first one. After supper, Clara washed and Elias dried, because he picked up the cloth from the counter without asking and she did not tell him to put it down. May swept the floor. Samuel was sent to bed after fighting it briefly and losing. When the kitchen was straight, Clara made 2 cups of coffee from the last of her grounds, and she handed him one. They stood on the porch in the failing light. The heat had broken just barely, and the western sky had gone the color of hammered brass, then copper, then the deep bruised purple that comes just before the stars take over entirely. "I meant what I said," she told him. "About what I need." "I know you did," he said. "I'm not saying it as an invitation," she said carefully. "I'm saying it so you understand what this situation is. This farm needs a man's name on the deed if it's going to survive what's coming. What's already been coming." He turned to look at her. "What's been coming?" She was quiet for long enough that the first stars appeared. "My husband's brother," she said finally. "Roy Aldean. He's been in Tucson. But he won't stay there." She took her coffee back inside. The screen door swung shut behind her with a soft, wooden sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Elias stood on the porch alone and drank his coffee and looked out at the dark and the land and thought about the 4 plates on the table. A week passed, and then another. Elias reset the fence posts along the north pasture, digging new holes with a post maul and tamping the caliche hard around each base with a steel rod. It was brutal work in the heat. He came in each evening with his shirt soaked through and his hands blistered in new places over the old calluses. And Clara would have water at the pump and a clean cloth left on the rail without comment. He was not a man who required much. He had learned years ago, working cattle drives from San Antonio north to Dodge, that the most dangerous thing on a long drive was not weather or rustlers or river crossings, it was wanting too much from the circumstances you were in. He had wanted less and less over the years, and it had served him well right up until the moment it had left him with nothing at all, no ranch, no wife, no child, no name on any deed or any door. The photograph in his breast pocket was of a woman and a small boy, taken in front of a frame house in Colorado. He didn't look at it often, but he kept it there. He taught Samuel how to coil a rope properly on the third morning. Samuel had been watching him from 30 feet away for 20 minutes before Elias held out the rope without turning his head and said, "You want to learn or you want to just look?" Samuel came forward immediately, as though he'd been holding himself back by sheer will. The boy had good hands. Patient ones. He learned the coil on his third try and did it again 6 times consecutively until it was correct each time. And then he looked up at Elias with an expression that broke something open just slightly in the older man's chest. "That'll do," Elias said. "Do it 100 more times and you'll never forget it." "Can I keep the rope?" Samuel asked. "That rope belongs to your mama's barn," Elias said. "But I'll make you one of your own." End of the week. He made it in 3 days. May was harder. She was not openly hostile, but she maintained a precise, formal distance from him that reminded him of a cat who had been startled badly once and now simply observed from high places. She was smart, smarter than most adults in the county, he suspected, and she watched him with a patience that was itself a kind of test. He passed it, eventually, without knowing exactly when. It happened on a Wednesday, when May was attempting to repair the kitchen window latch that had been broken since before he arrived. She had the screwdriver and the latch plate, but the wood around the frame had swelled and she couldn't get enough angle. Elias came through the kitchen for water and saw her working at it and said nothing, just pulled a chair over, sat down, and held the frame steady while she drove the screws in. When it was done, she tested the latch 4 times. It held each time. "Thank you," she said, very precisely. "Good work," he said. That was all. But something had shifted. 40 miles east and south, in a town called Ozona, Roy Aldian sat at a table in the back of a saloon that smelled of sour mash and men who hadn't worked in a week. He was a lean, cold-eyed man who wore his hat down and his opinions loud, and he had been drinking since mid-afternoon, which was not unusual for him. What was unusual was the piece of paper on the table in front of him, which a man named Gibbs had ridden 3 days to deliver. It was a copy of Thomas Aldian's will. Roy had read it 6 times and his reading had not improved it. The farm, 312 acres of Crockett County grassland and the mineral rights beneath it, which had recently become interesting to a railroad survey crew working westward, went to Clara and the children outright. There was a provision that Roy received nothing in the event of Thomas dying before him, and Thomas had written it in his own hand and had it witnessed by a judge in Abilene. Thomas had not trusted his brother. He had been correct not to. "She's got a man working the place now," Gibbs said, picking his teeth. "What kind of man?" "Drifter. Name of cord. Used to work cattle up north. Looks like he's putting down roots." Roy Aldian folded the paper carefully and put it in his pocket. He signaled for another drink. "Railroad comes through that land," he said quietly, "and it's worth more money than either of us has ever seen. So what do you want to do?" Roy looked at his glass. "I want to see my sister-in-law," he said. "Pay my respects. Been meaning to, after poor Thomas passed." He smiled with his mouth only. "I'll ride out in a week. Maybe 2. Let her get comfortable first." The nearest town was Cowboy Flat, which was not a town so much as a collection of buildings that had agreed to stay close together out of mutual loneliness. There was Prater's general store, a post office the size of a generous closet, a church, a livery, a barber shop that doubled as the doctor's office on Thursdays, and a saloon that was never closed and a school that often was. Clara drove the wagon in on a Friday with May and Samuel and Elias riding on the bench beside her because she needed help loading 50 pounds of grain and a new plough blade. It was the first time Elias had been to town since his arrival, and he felt the eyes on them before the wagon had cleared the main intersection. People in small places feel the presence of change the way old wounds feel weather. In Prater's store, a woman named Evelyn Hardcastle, the wife of the county tax assessor and the unofficial keeper of Cowboy Flat's social ledger, appeared at Clara's elbow with the smooth, practiced manner of a woman who had spent years making intrusions feel like coincidences. "Clara," she said warmly, taking Clara's hands. "We have been thinking about you so much. All of us have." "That's kind," Clara said, and kept moving toward the grain. "And who is this?" Evelyn turned to Elias with a smile that did not reach her actual eyes. "Elias Cord," he said. "He's working the farm," Clara said flatly. "Is he now?" Evelyn's smile adjusted slightly. "How wonderful. Living on the property." "In the bunkroom," Clara said. Evelyn touched her own collar. "I only ask because, well, people do talk, Clara." "And with Thomas gone not even 6 months, 8 months, Clara said. "People worry about appearances. Particularly for the children's sake." She said it gently, as though she were offering medicine. Elias had turned away to examine a display of horseshoe nails with great apparent interest. Clara was quiet for a moment that held considerable weight. "The children are fed," she said then. "The fence is mended. The roof will be repaired before winter. The grain is getting planted. I appreciate the concern." She moved to the counter. Evelyn shifted her attention to Elias like a hawk adjusting its perch. "And where are you from, Mr. Cord?" "Various places," he said. "Have you family?" He turned from the display. "Not presently," he said. His voice was even and polite. There was nothing to grab onto in it. Outside, while the grain was being loaded, a man named Tully Deeks, who ran the livery and had opinions on everything with the confidence of a man who had rarely been wrong about anything that didn't matter, leaned against the post in front of his establishment and spoke too loudly to his companion about how it was a peculiar arrangement. A widow woman taking in a vagrant, and how he wouldn't stand for it if it were his sister. Elias heard it. He carried a 50-pound sack of grain on each shoulder to the wagon, set them down with care, and then walked to the livery. He stopped in front of Deeks and looked at him for a moment. He was not threatening in any visible way. His hands were at his sides. His voice, when he spoke, was the same quiet, level register it always was. "I didn't catch your name," he said. Deeks told him. "Mr. Deeks," Elias said. "I've worked my whole life. I've trailed cattle in weather that would have ended a lesser man. I am working an honest job for an honest wage for a woman who is holding a farm together with nothing but her own will. I don't drink. I don't gamble. I don't trouble anybody." He paused. "I'd take it as a courtesy if you'd speak of her with the respect she's earned." Deeks said nothing. "Appreciate it," Elias said, and walked back to the wagon. Clara had seen it from the store doorway. When he climbed up to the bench and took the reins, she said nothing for the first quarter mile. Then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. A silence. "Thank you," she said. It came out differently than May's had, lower, more careful, as though she had to bring it up from somewhere she'd been keeping it stored. He nodded and kept his eyes on the road. Samuel had fallen asleep against Clara's arm. May was reading a primer in the wagon bed. The land opened up around them, flat and wide and blinding, and the sky was the kind of blue that has no mercy in it, and the whole world felt, for one suspended moment, Like something that might be all right. That night, after supper, Clara set a tin of lemon drops on the table in front of Elias. He looked at them. "You've had a cough," she said, already moving back toward the stove. "3 nights running." "I heard it." He picked up the tin and looked at it for a moment longer than was necessary. "That's kind," he said. She said, "It's just lemon drops." But it wasn't, and they both knew it. Roy Aldian arrived on a Sunday. He did not send word ahead. He simply appeared at the end of the lane in the late afternoon, riding a good sorrel horse and wearing clean clothes that had been bought for the occasion. Which meant he had thought about what impression he wanted to make and had chosen carefully. Clara saw him from the garden and stood up slowly, pressing the dirt from her hands against her apron. The look that crossed her face was not fear exactly, it was something more seasoned than fear, the flat recognition of a thing you have been dreading and have now run out of road to avoid. Elias was replacing shingles on the barn roof and did not see Roy arrive. Samuel ran out to watch the horse, because Samuel was 7 and a good horse could momentarily override every other instinct. May appeared from nowhere and pulled Samuel back by the sleeve without being asked. Roy dismounted in the yard and took off his hat. "Clara," he said. "You look well." "Roy," she said. He looked around the property with an assessing eye. "Place is looking better than I expected. Thomas would be glad." "Don't," she said quietly. He smiled. He had the kind of smile that looked correct but functioned like a locked door. "I'm here to help. Family looking after family. It's what Thomas would have wanted." "Thomas left a will," she said. "He did. I've seen it." He glanced toward the barn. "Who've you got working up there?" "A hired hand." Roy put his hat back on. "Funny thing. A friend of mine came through Cowboy flat and heard some talk. About a drifter living on the property. A widow woman and 2 children and a strange man under the same roof." He shook his head with theatrical concern. "That's the kind of talk that can get a woman's fitness as a mother questioned in a court of law." Clara's jaw tightened, but she did not step back. "You'd need evidence," she said. "I'd need a judge who's sympathetic," he said pleasantly. "And I happen to know one." Elias had come down from the roof. He crossed the yard with unhurried steps, wiping his hands on a rag. Roy watched him come. "Roy Aldian," Elias said. "Not a question." "That's right." Roy looked him up and down with the professional contempt of a man who believes size is a measure of importance. "Mrs. Aldian's property," Elias said, gesturing mildly at the ground beneath their feet. "You're welcome to stay the night if you need rest from the road." "1 night. The offer doesn't extend." Roy looked at Clara. "You're letting your hired man speak for you now?" "He's saying what I'd say," she told him. Roy stayed for supper because refusing would have undercut the image of familial reasonableness he was cultivating. He ate and he spoke lightly of nothing particular and watched everything, the way a man does when he's conducting an inventory. When he left, he shook Elias's hand, which surprised them both. "You seem like a man with some sense," Roy said quietly, beneath the noise of May clearing plates inside. "A man like you could do better than a struggling widow farm. I could make it worth your while to move on." Elias looked at their joined hands. Then he released his grip. "Good night, Mr. Aldian," he said. He came back that night. Elias had not expected it so soon. The calculation had seemed too crude, too impatient, for a man who appeared to be playing a longer game. But Roy Aldian had also been drinking since he'd left, which shortens the distance between intention and action considerably. Elias woke at midnight to the sound of the stock shifting in the pen. Not the restless movement of animals uncomfortable in the heat, something purposeful. He was dressed and had the rifle in hand before he was fully thinking. He went out the bunkroom door in his boots and moved through the dark with the particular quiet of a man who has spent years reading silence for the things it hides. The sky was brilliant with stars and the moon was 3/4 full, which gave the yard a silver-grey light the color of old pewter. Roy was at the fence of the stock pen. He had a lantern shuttered down to almost nothing, and he was working at the gate latch. Elias couldn't immediately see his intention, whether he meant to scatter the animals, harm them, or simply create a grievance to bring to that sympathetic judge. "Roy," Elias said. Roy spun and reached for his hip. Elias had the rifle up and level. "Don't," Elias said. His voice was the same as it always was. That was the part Roy found alarming. Elias suspected that there was no escalation in it, no heat, just the steady, flat assurance of a man who has made his decision in advance. Roy's hand stopped. He stood very still. "Get on your horse," Elias said. "You don't know what you're in the middle of," Roy said. His voice had gone thin. "That railroad survey, this land is worth, I know what I'm in the middle of," Elias said. He walked forward until he was 10 feet away. "You came to that house this evening and you ate at that table and you smiled and you made your calculations. And now you're out here in the dark trying to hurt those children's livelihood." He paused. "I'm going to ask you one more time to get on your horse. After that I'm going to fire this rifle into the air. And when the sheriff rides out in the morning I'm going to show him the tracks and the gate latch and I'm going to describe exactly what I saw." Roy Aldian got on his horse. He rode without looking back. Elias stood in the silver yard for a long time. After a while, he heard the screen door and then Clara's bare feet on the porch boards. "I heard voices," she said. Roy paid a second visit, he said. "He won't be back tonight." She was quiet. "The children?" he asked. "Asleep," she said. "Still." He came and sat on the porch step. She sat in the chair behind him. Neither of them spoke for a while. The stars were enormous and indifferent and beautiful all at once. "Elias," she said finally. "Yes." "Why are you staying?" He thought about the photograph in his breast pocket. He thought about the 4 plates on the table and the lemon drops on the counter and Samuel's serious face learning the rope coil and May testing the window latch for times. "Because someone should," he said. She didn't say anything after that. But she stayed on the porch until the cold came in, and she didn't go back inside until he did. It was May who made him understand the full weight of the thing. 3 mornings after Roy's midnight visit, she found Elias at the pump and said, without preliminary, "My uncle is going to try to take the farm." Elias dried his hands. "What makes you say that?" "I'm 10, she said. "I'm not simple." She crossed her arms, a gesture so reminiscent of her mother that it would have been amusing under any other circumstance. He looked at everything when he was here. He looked at the barn, the well, the south pasture. He was counting, not visiting. "You're right," Elias said. "So what are you going to do about it?" He looked at her for a moment. "What would you like me to do about it?" May considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I'd like you to make sure we don't lose this place," she said. "It's where my father is buried. He's in the northeast corner by the Cartonwood. I'm not leaving him there alone." Elias felt something in his chest pull in a way that had no name he knew. "I'll handle it," he said. "How?" she asked. "First I'm going to ride to Abilene and talk to a lawyer." The lawyer's name was Garfield Mace. And he had an office above the harness shop on Chestnut Street that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. He was a thin man with the mild, attentive expression of someone who has spent 30 years listening carefully and found it more reliable than speaking. He heard Elias out without interruption, made several careful notes, and then leaned back in his chair. "The will is solid," he said. Thomas Aldian was careful. "Roy has no legal claim to the property." He mentioned a judge, Elias said. "Calhoun County has 3 judges and Roy Aldian doesn't have the money or reputation to get in front of any of them with a case that thin." Mace tapped his pen. "But he could make noise. File motions. Challenge the fitness of an unmarried woman managing property of that value. It wouldn't succeed, but it would be expensive and it would take time. How do we stop it before it starts?" Mace looked at him over his spectacles. You are aware, I take it, that the straightest legal barrier between Roy Aldian and that property would be Mrs. Aldian's remarriage. A husband has standing to defend property that a widow, under current statutes, must argue for from a weaker position. Elias said nothing. Mace put his pen down. I take it this is not a simple legal consultation. It's becoming something more than that, Elias said carefully. Mace nodded slowly. I can draft a property deed amendment naming you as a working partner, which would complicate Roy's attempts considerably. It's not marriage, but it's something. Or, he left the other option in the air between them. He rode back to the farm in the late afternoon with the hammered brass light coming in from the west, and he found Clara in the kitchen garden, fighting a patch of bindweed that had come up overnight around the tomato plants. She was working at it with a kind of methodical ferocity that he had come to recognize as her response to things she couldn't directly confront. I talked to a lawyer in Abilene, he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. He told her what Mace had said. All of it. He did not shade it or make it easier. She listened with her hands resting on her knees and her eyes on his face, reading him the way she'd learned to read weather. When he was done, she said, you went to Abilene for me. For all of you, he said. She looked at the garden. A mockingbird was going on at length somewhere in the mesquite at the fence line, running through its whole catalogue of borrowed songs. The partnership deed, she said slowly. That protects the property. It complicates Roy's case substantially. May says he'd have to fight two of us instead of one, and his legal grounds get narrower. And the other thing May suggested, she said. Not asking. Just acknowledging that it had been said. Is also a thing, he said. She stood up. She was not a small woman, but standing there in the late light with dirt on her apron and her hair escaping its pins, she looked, for just a moment, very tired and very young simultaneously. I want to say something to you, she said, and I need you to let me say it plain. Yes, m'm. I don't want a husband the way women in novels want them. I don't want someone to take over my life or my decisions or my name in any way that diminishes what I've built. She met his eyes directly. But I am a practical woman. And I am looking at a man who reset my fence and fixed my barn door and taught my son to coil a rope and stood in my yard with a rifle at midnight for children he has no obligation to. And I am wondering if a practical arrangement between two honest people might grow into something that isn't just practical. He was quiet for long enough that the mockingbird changed to a new song. I believe it might, he said. They were married on a Thursday in October by the same church in Cowboy Flat that had watched Thomas Aldian's funeral. Which struck Clara as fitting, that rooms of meaning do not belong to only one feeling. Garfield Mace rode out from Abilene to witness the signing of the partnership deed simultaneously, which made the whole proceeding feel unusually businesslike and unusually right. Evelyn Hardcastle attended the service with a corsage and an expression of having been personally vindicated, which Clara tolerated because she was in too good a spirit to correct it. Tully Deeks was not invited and did not come, but he did stop making loud comments at the livery, which counted for something. Roy Aldian received a certified letter from Mace's office 2 weeks later. It outlined the new legal standing of the property, the partnership deed, and the marriage certificate. And it included a polite and very precise statement of what Roy would face should he continue to press any claim, financial, legal, or otherwise. Roy Aldian was not a man of great courage, as most men who operate from the margins of legal decency are not. He read the letter 3 times, put it away, and made no further contact. The land, it turned out, was not acquired by the railroad. The survey shifted south after a geological assessment and the Aldian farm sat outside the easement. This eliminated the fortune Roy had imagined, and without it, he had no motivation sufficient to sustain a prolonged fight. He returned to Tucson and faded from the margins of their lives the way dust fades after a wagon passes, gradually, and then completely. May was the one who asked Elias, finally, in the kitchen one Sunday morning while Clara was at the well and Samuel was asleep, asked him what he was before he came here. He was cutting the bread and he kept cutting it for a moment before he answered. I was a man who'd lost things, he said. What things? He thought about the photograph. He looked at it sometimes still, though less often now. And when he did, he felt grief that was clean and real and not debilitating, the kind of grief that has been lived with long enough to become part of the furniture of your interior rather than a wound. A wife, he said. A son. A fever took them in Colorado. 8 years ago now. May was quiet. Does Mama know? She asked. She does, he said. Good, May said, with the tone of a person completing an accounting. I think you should keep their picture where you have it. It seems right. She went outside without further comment. Elias put down the bread knife and stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the smell of coffee and wood smoke and the ordinary, irreplaceable warmth of a house that was functioning as a home. Then he picked the knife back up and finished cutting the bread. There is a notion that broken things, once broken, carry their fractures permanently, that the cracks remain visible no matter how carefully you piece the edges back together. And maybe that is true. Maybe it is even better that it is true. Because the farm did not become what it was before. It became something different. The fence lines were straighter. The garden was larger. The barn roof held through 2 winters and a hailstorm that bent the mesquite flat. Samuel learned to handle a horse and then to work cattle and then, in time, to read the land the way his father before him never quite had. May became, in the fullness of years, a woman who kept good books and ran the property operation with an efficiency that drew admiration from men twice her age who expected to feel none. And Clara, who had stood in a hot yard with her hand near a rifle and looked at a tired, road-worn stranger and said the truest thing she knew, that she didn't need a cowboy. She needed a husband, learned that the things we say in exhausted honesty are often the most accurate maps we ever draw of our own hearts. Elias Cord was buried, many years later, in the northeast corner of the property, beside the Cartonwood. Beside Thomas Aldean. May had insisted on it. Because broken places, when tended with patience and good faith and the willingness to remain through difficulty, do not stay broken. They grow back. And sometimes, if you are fortunate, they grow back into something stronger, stranger, and more deeply rooted than anything that stood there before.